Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks, those of you that are here in person. Thanks those that are joining online. And we're in for some fun tonight. I don't have all the answers. I might have some questions of my own that you guys can help me with. But just to remind you of a couple things, if you are new to watching at home, there are some notes that go along with this. If you go to our Valley Forth Church's website, and under the menus, you go to Ministries and Adult Bible Study, and you can find the notes. And they come in two forms. The notes come, scroll down a little bit. The digital fill-in notes, which is what we'll work on together on the screen, where you can pull those up on your church app if you're used to doing that on Sunday mornings. And of course, printable ones if you wanted to print them at home. Also, if you're interested in submitting a question from viewing from home, you can just scroll to the bottom of that page, and there's a spot to submit a question, and we'll try to remember to check that at the end. So let's begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll get into this. Father, we do love you, and thank you for a night to gather here in various places to study your word together, to see how men and women from many centuries ago sought to follow you and the struggles that they went through. Father, help us to find commonality with them in ways that would help encourage us in our walk with you. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're going to pop back to something we discussed briefly at the very first meeting, which is how to read a biblical narrative. Now, as you read a story in the Bible, there's a lot of stories in the Bible. About 40% of the Bible is full of stories. And that seems like a lot, and it is. A lot of redemptive history is going on there, a lot of stuff going on, Old Testament and New Testament, of course, and a lot of narratives in the Gospels as well. So how do we read a narrative in the Bible? There's three key components that make up a narrative. The first is setting. Time, place, season, geography, etc. So, we'll see a couple of stories that involve caves or wilderness, hiking, far and things like that. Elements of setting that contribute to the development of the story. Of course, characters, how they are described. So if there's just a description given, that's the narrator giving the description of the character, or if another character describes them, or we just learn by their behavior over time, kind of how they are, their roles. We see them in dialogue. Those are how characters are developed. And this is, how any literature or even movies works. We see characters develop as we watch the story. And then, of course, is plot. The plot in biblical narrative often involves opening. The conflict comes in typically rather quickly in the story, and most of the plot involves this kind of rising intensity of the plot until there's some kind of climax resolution of the plot, and then it moves to a conclusion. Why are those things important? Well, they kind of help us find the meaning of the biblical narrative. But there's a couple real specific principles I want you guys to remember. We've talked about this. God is always a character in every story. He's also the true hero. So even if he's not named, the narrator always assumes that God is a character in the story because he acts, right? There's many things that he does or doesn't do, and so he acts in that way. He's also the true hero. Now there are human heroes, of course. David and Goliath, we see David, provide the deliverance. But even David is not always the hero of the story. When we get to chapter 25, it'll actually be a woman, Abigail, who is the hero that saves David from a great mistake. Biblical narratives are not isolated. What do I mean by this? This is one of the reasons we're doing a study like this. The significance of one biblical narrative finds a significance in the whole story. If you just took one of these isolated stories apart from any of the rest of the context, you might come up with some interesting conclusions, like chapter 21 that we'll get to in a little bit. If you hadn't read what comes before and what comes after, it doesn't make as much sense. And so we got to see the story in the context of the whole story. Obviously, that also includes the movement from the very beginning to the very end. Genesis, sin enters the world. There's the curse, and there's this ongoing battle between, we'll call it the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, who will eventually be, Abraham's offspring, eventually Christ, of course, and those that would oppose God's way. Also, very important for our discussions today, biblical narratives do not necessarily approve of what they record. This really confuses people beginning to read their Bibles for the first times. They read something in the Bible and say, wow, how could that be in the Bible? Simple answer is that's because of the way life is. I mean, bad things happen in life. Bad people do bad things. And it's actually kind of nice for us that most of the heroes in the biblical stories, we see their warts and we see their flaws. We'll see some of David's flaws today. Up to this point, he's been portrayed pretty positively. So we're going to start to see a few flaws come out. And this is good because it helps us to be able to relate and know that the Bible speaks with reality to the things of life. Okay. Also, we do a quick review to see where we're at in the story, to remember, of course, Samuel in the first 7 chapters, the last judge, until chapter 8 when they choose the first king, Saul. There's a period there where Samuel and Saul overlap, and then last week, chapter 16, brought us into this interesting era of 2 kings. So Saul is still king, he is still on the throne, but David has been anointed as king and selected as the next king. The only problem is that Saul is still reigning, and there's this tension, right, for many chapters actually, where this is the case. David knows he's the next king, and we see many of the characters in the story know that David's going to be the next king, but Saul is still king. So there's tension that comes there. So here's some of the parts here. First story, David takes the holy bread at a city called Nob as he's fleeing. And then David flees to Gath, a Philistine city. Yikes, why would he go there? We'll think about that. Next, we see David in the cave of Adullam. Little side note, there's a number of caves in our stories today. And there are lots of caves in this area. It's not like here where you might be going out in the woods, you'd be surprised maybe to find a cave, but there'd be caves all over the place. So that's a geography piece that's helpful to know. There's kind of a terrible story where Saul kills all the priests at the city of Nob. Only one of them escapes, and David provides safety for Abiathar, the one that escapes Saul's murderous rage. Then we see David rescuing Keilah, a city from the Philistines. This was a city that was kind of a border city close to the Philistines and was in trouble. And then we just see kind of this cat and mouse game of Saul pursuing and David fleeing, and they're kind of going back and forth all over the place in the wilderness and hiding. So Saul pursues David in the wilderness. And we get to this interesting story where David spares Saul's life in the cave. There's a little bit of humor in that story even. And we're going to finish our study tonight with Abigail. Trying to remember what I was going to put here. Abigail prevents David from wrongdoing. I'm going to mention a couple things a little further here so that it can make sense here. Right after that, we see David spares Saul's life again in the wilderness. So if you're paying attention here, you look at chapter 24, David spares Saul's life. Then there's kind of this in-between story with Abigail, and then David spares Saul's life again. So they're kind of sandwiched together like that. The narrator does things like that intentionally often. And we just see it continue. David just continues to flee, and Saul pursues for the next, until the end of chapter 30. And then the last element of the 2 kings involves Saul's death and David's response to it, which is also interesting. Then, of course, we get into David's reign, which starts good, and then there's some more dark days for David's reign before the end of his reign there in 2 Samuel. All right. So our first story, David takes the holy bread at Nob. Let's look at this real quick. This is, remember, right after David had learned for sure that Saul was trying to kill him. Jonathan had set up things to find this out for sure, and Jonathan and David meet. Jonathan confirms to David, Saul's out to get you, and says, you've got to run, you've got to flee. So David flees, presumably without a lot of notice, and this is what it says. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came to meet David, trembling, and said to him, why are you alone, and no one is with you? Why were they trembling? Well, maybe they knew what was going on. David said to Ahimelech the priest, the king has charged me with the matter, and said to me, let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you, to which I have already charged you. Let's see here. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here. And the priest answered to David, I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have kept themselves from women. And David answered the priest, truly women have been kept from us, as always, when we go on expedition. Vessels of the young men are holy, even when it's an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy? So the priest gave him the holy bread, and there was no bread there, but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord, to be replaced by hot bread on the day that it is taken away. Verse 7 is kind of this ominous foreshadowing. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. Then David said to Ahimelech, then have you not here a spear or a sword on hand? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. And the priest said, the sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take it, take it, and for there is none but that here. And David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. So that's the story. So what do we make of all this? David is on the run for his life, and he doesn't have anything with him. So he goes to Ahimelech the priest. I suspect he knew that that sword was there. I mean, you don't just like misplace Goliath's sword. We don't know exactly, where it went after he killed Goliath, but he may have known it was there. Had a relationship perhaps with Ahimelech to know that it was there. And he goes and he wants bread, and so he asks about it. And there's the deal with the holy bread. We'll get to the holy bread in just a little bit. What's interesting though is what David says he's doing. What fabrication does he give to Ahimelech to say why he's there? Yes, I'm on a secret mission from the king. Shh, don't tell anybody. And it seems like he kind of adds some details to that. It's even suspect of whether there was even young men nearby or with him, or whether he was actually alone, if that was part of the lie or not. He basically lies to the priest, and we'll get to why that was here in a minute. But the priest gives him the holy bread, which was only for the priest. So we'll, it was day-old bread. We'll come back to this little thing here, and I want to get to the holy bread here. So what is the holy bread? It says here in, what is this? Leviticus chapter 24. We have instructions about the holy bread. You shall take fine flour and bake 12 loaves from it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each loaf, and you shall set them in 2 piles, 6 in a pile, on the table of pure gold before the Lord. And you shall put pure frankincense on each pile, so that it may go with the bread as a memorial portion, as a food offering to the Lord. Every Sabbath day Aaron shall arrange it, or Aaron's descendant, before the Lord regularly. It is from the people of Israel as a covenant forever. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in the holy place, since it is for him a most holy portion out of the Lord's food offering, a perpetual due. So this bread is called the holy bread, or the bread of the presence. It was baked weekly, and it was put in there on the Sabbath. And it seems like later in that day, possibly, that the priest would eat it, or at least later in the week. It's uncertain. So this bread was put in there weekly, and that was the only bread that they have on hand. Now that bread was not supposed to be consumed by ordinary people. That was designed for Aaron and his descendants, the priests, to eat. So Abiathar really fudges the rules here to be able to give it to David. So that's what the holy bread is. What makes this story particularly interesting that I wrestled with this week is that Jesus mentions this story. So here's what happens in Mark chapter 2, starting verse 23. One Sabbath, he, Jesus, was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying, "Look, why are they doing this? What is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Which is kind of true, but kind of not true. It was actually lawful to pluck some of your neighbor's grain to eat it on the Sabbath. It seemed more likely the Pharisees were concerned with how far the disciples had walked to be able to do this, or that they had misunderstood and still classified this as work to pluck this. She said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? He entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for men, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So Jesus uses this story in David's life as an example to show that people are more important than the Sabbath rules. But there's much more at play here than just the Sabbath, of course. So let's find our way back to our notes. Excuse me. So what themes do we see in here? We certainly see some deception that happens. But is that deception okay or is it not? We see the anointed king is fleeing for his life. So as we think about this and try to bring it to the gospel, I think this is kind of how it makes the most sense. Why does Jesus bring up this story? I think Jesus is saying in his time, because I was reading in Mark's context, they were trying to kill him, for all these things that he was doing. Jesus is comparing himself to David. And the Pharisees would be like Saul in that sense, because Saul is pursuing David to kill him, to try to kill the Lord's anointed king, similar to the way that the Pharisees and all their allies are trying to kill the anointed Messiah. Many have tried to kill the anointed king. You think of King Herod in the infanticide in the Christmas story, trying to kill all the babies in order to kill the anointed king. But God protects his anointed king, the Messiah. I think that's the biggest picture of how this points us forward. There are things related to the Sabbath here, of course, and Christ fulfilling some of the typological things that are going on here. So there's that. How do we apply this? At first we think, well, gosh, I've never been on the run for my life from an evil tyrant, but we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss that, because some people are. I was thinking back to a time I talked to a man who had come out of Cambodia in the 70s. And he told me about how him and his wife fled for their wives through the jungle, and his wife even gave birth in the jungle as they were fleeing for their lives. And people do it today in various parts of our world. So we shouldn't dismiss that someone could really relate to this in a very real way, that this can happen. But most of us, at least living here in America at this time, don't flee for our lives. But we should, think about those that do. And there's other things we could consider there. We need to move on, though, because there's a lot of stuff to cover here. Why does David lie to the priest? Was it the right choice? Well, let's answer the first question first. Why do you think David lies to the priest? What do you guys think? Yeah. Doesn't want to blow his cover. Yeah, who does he want to protect? Himself, probably. But also the priest, perhaps. Remember, he notices Doeg standing there in the corner. We don't know if David trusts the priest this time. Likely he could, but because this other guy is standing there, he wants to maybe give Abiathar a reasonable reason to do what he's doing, and so he kind of does it for that. So does it make it right? This is a really muddy one. In times of war, when people are pursuing you, trying to kill you, it seems okay to lie to protect yourself and other people from harm. But, of course, it ends up still not protecting the priest, as we'll see later on. He encounters harm because of that, but that's ultimately not David's fault. So, after this, David flees to Gath, which is really odd. Gath is a Philistine city. What is David most famous for? Killing a Philistine giant. Why in the world would he go there? This is one of those things we just kind of shake our head at and think, David, what were you thinking going to Gath? And when he goes down there, he thinks he's going to be unnoticed, but they immediately recognize him. In fact, they call him the king of Israel, which is interesting, because that's kind of foreshadowing. He's the anointed king. They recognize him as that. And he has to pretend to be insane, essentially, so they don't kill him. While he is there in Gath, he composes a couple of psalms. Here we've got a couple verses from Psalm 34 in your notes. You see in the superscription. So the superscription is those lines right before the psalm starts. And just an important note there, sometimes people think that those may not be part of the original text. But let me just open this up here so I can show you. Psalm 34, right? That one we're on. So these titles like this that says taste and see that the Lord is good, the translators have put those in just as helpful headings for us. But when we see after the big number 34, this part of David, when he changed his behavior before Ahimelech so that he drove him out and he went away, that is part of the original Hebrew manuscript. So in my opinion, those are really part of the scripture, important parts of the psalm. And in fact, the Hebrew Bible, the superscription would be verse 1, and then our verse 1 would be their verse 2. That's how they see it. So don't just gloss over those little superscriptions, what they're called. So when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, drove him out and went away, here's the last words of that psalm. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. Affliction will slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. The Lord redeems the life of his servants. None of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. So words uttered then. The interesting line to me is this one, where David says about how he keeps all of his bones and not one of them is broken. You remember when that's mentioned? That's mentioned about Christ on the cross when they decide not to break his bones because he is already dead. So this psalm that David writes in 34 actually even has a prophetic line in it there that gets used thinking about the cross. So he doesn't last in Gath very long. There's another one there. There's a number of psalms I reference here. We don't have time to look at them all right now, but I encourage you to read these because they help to make sense of it. So here's a map. Maps are helpful because they're going all over the place. So he's starting in Gibeah. He goes up to Ramah for a little bit. What'd you say? Oh, is it not? We lost our connection. It's because my firewall turned itself back on. I have to turn that off to let everything get through. Did it come back? Okay. Thank you for calling that out. So Gibeah is just a little bit north of Jerusalem. And you see Nob here is pretty close to Jerusalem also. So early on in 1 Samuel, the kind of tabernacle, the place of worship, was in Shiloh. It seems like after all that, eventually all the priests in the worship moved to Nob. And so you see there's Nob. But then when David flees to Gath, he's fleeing, pretty far away over to Philistine territory. So we kind of talked about some of those themes already. Next he goes to hide in a cave. So let's go to 1 Samuel 22. David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. So apparently David's family is also in danger because of this. And everyone who is in distress, everyone who is in debt, everyone who is bitter in soul gathered to him. You're like, well, that's a great group of people. But I think it certainly foreshadows Christ's ministry, doesn't it? Remember how all the tax collectors, sinners, prostitutes, people who are desperate, everyone like that's kind of attracted to Christ. And David, all these people are attracted to him, but he actually they are very loyal to him, and they become a pretty good little militia that take care of themselves and others along the way. David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. He said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and mother stay with you till I know what God will do for me." He left them there with the king of Moab and stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gad, who will show up later in the story also, said to David, "Do not remain in the stronghold, depart, go back to the land of Judah." So he departed there and went to the forest of Hereth. We don't know exactly where that forest is. But I want to make a couple of comments about Moab. So do we have another map in your notes? I thought we did. Yep, here we go. So the cave of Adullam is not horribly far from Gath. It's actually not far from the valley of Elah, where David slew the Philistine. So he's hiding there for a while, and there his family comes, and he takes them all the way to Moab. Now this is not a small journey. If you know anything about the geography over there, the Dead Sea is super low in elevation. Over here, so you're higher up, and on the other side you're higher up. So it involved many miles of traversing, 3,000-foot descent, and ascending again on the other side when they got on the other side of the Dead Sea up into the plains of Moab. So why Moab? That's one of the questions there. Why do you think David took his family to Moab? Yes, that is where Ruth is from. Who is Ruth? It is David's great-grandmother, his father Jesse's grandmother. Ruth is from Moab. So David perceives that they will find safety there. And so we haven't heard much about Moab to this point. All their fighting has kind of been, on this side or down here with the Amalekites. But Moab's there on the other side of the Dead Sea. But the prophet Gad says, "Hey, you got to go back." So he goes all the way back over here. The person that made this map guessed that that's where Hereth was. We don't really know exactly where that was. So at least his family is safe. So we just talked about that question. Why does David take his family to Moab? What kind of themes do we see in this section? We see God's protection. And we'll see this throughout this whole swath that Saul keeps pursuing, but no matter Saul's, best attempt, he cannot harm David because he is the Lord's anointed. God protects him, similar to the way that God will certainly protect Christ through much opposition until the time would be right for his crucifixion. We could also take some personal applications there about God's protection in our own life. Reading Psalms, a couple of Psalms I put in your notes there, Psalm 56 and Psalm 142 that were composed during that time speak about God's protection and deliverance. We can certainly, grab onto some of that, even thinking about God protecting us as we go about our days in this era. So a lot more to cover here, though. We get to this terrible story where Saul kills the priests at Nob. So the short version of the story is Saul finds out that David fled and got help from Ahimelech. He questions him. Ahimelech gives his reasoning, but Saul doesn't buy it. He has Ahimelech killed and has all of the priests in Nob and even all the people and their inhabitants in Nob killed. It's kind of, it's what he failed to do to the Amalekites, he does to the priests in his own country, as he destroys everyone. And we're kind of left wondering, what's really going on here? Well, there's always more than one level going on. The priests at Nob represent Eli's descendants. If we backtrack here to 1 Samuel 2:31, through a prophet, God said, "Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength," this is speaking to Eli, "and the strength of your father's house, and there will not be any old man in your house. Then in distress you will look with the envious eye on all the prosperity that shall be bestowed on Israel, and there shall not be an old man in your house forever. The only one of you whom I shall not cut off from my altar shall be spared to weep his eyes out, to grieve his heart, and all the descendants of your house shall die by the sword of men." This is very specific, and it's actually fulfilled in the chapter 22 that we read, right? Because one person does escape. And I get their names mixed up because they both start with A. Okay, so Abiathar is the son. He's the one that escapes and goes to David. Abiathar ends up being loyal and being a servant to David for really the rest of the story. In fact, Solomon sees Abiathar as a threat later, but Abiathar remains loyal to David for a long time. Another sub-theme we see in here that I kind of forgot to mention is loyalty. Where do people's loyalties lie? We see people are loyal to David, like the priests and like Jonathan. We see Doeg the Edomite, who is loyal to Saul. We see when Saul commands some of the people there to strike down the priests, that they won't. They say, King, we're not going to do that. That's, we can't do that. And it takes Doeg to do that. So Abiathar escapes. He goes and tells David everything that happens. David kind of recognizes that some of this is because, he was there. But I don't know if there was anything else he could do about it. Chapter 23 begins with the story of David rescuing a city called Keilah from the Philistines. I don't know if I pronounced that right. We're not going to look at that story, but the important thing to note is the Philistines were attacking a city of Israel. Who should have gone to rescue it? Saul. But what was Saul busy doing? Chasing David. Yeah. But what does David do while being chased by Saul? Goes and rescues the city. Yeah. So it highlights how bad Saul's condition is. He's neglecting one of the key duties as king, which is to protect one of his own cities that's being invaded. It happens during the harvest time. This was kind of cyclical. The Philistines were smart. They would come in the early summer, right, during harvest time, is they swoop in, grab all the food, and run off with it. After that, David inquires of the Lord whether he should stay there. God tells him, you should leave because you're not safe here. And Saul pursues David in the wilderness, and David goes all over the place. Here we have another psalm, Psalm 63, composed when he was in the wilderness. O God, you are my God, earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you, my flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Speaking of water. But those who seek to destroy my life shall go down into the depths of the earth. They shall be given over to the power of the sword. It shall be a portion for jackals, but the king shall rejoice in their God, and all who swear by him shall exult. The mouths of the liars will be stopped. So David is fairly trusting to this point. All right, David spares Saul's life in the cave. So 1 Samuel 24. So they've been at this cat and mouse game for a while. Saul continues to chase David, and intelligence is kind of going both ways, right? Saul keeps getting reports of where David is, but David's getting reports of where Saul is, so they just kind of all keep moving around. So here Saul hears that David is in Gedi, so Saul takes 3,000 men to go and to get him. And so if you remember, David initially started with 400 men, eventually gets to 600 men. So even if this is the 600 and Saul has 3,000, this isn't a particularly fair fight on the outset. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. Now talk about irony. Saul has to go to the bathroom. He goes in a cave, of which there are many caves in the area. And he just happens to pick the cave that David and his men are hiding in the back of. Wow. David's men in this story see this as very fortuitous, right? What do they think should happen? Yeah, get him. God's given your enemy into your hand. This is providential, right? This is God's opportunity for you. And there are, by the way, significant applications for us, because I hear a lot of people like to look at circumstances in life as God's, approval of something. Well, this opportunity came up, so it must have been from God that God wanted me to do it. And it may be, but it may not be. Just because a circumstance is there does not guarantee that that is God's will for you. And it seems here that David actually has to really convince his men to kind of, leave Saul alone. Here's the day, that the Lord said to you, behold, I will Oh, they're even spiritual about it, right? David's men say, this is the day that God told you about, that gave you the enemy in your hand. David arose, stealthily cut off the corner of Saul's robe. We don't know if he went up with the knife in order to kill him and then, partway there realized, shouldn't do that. It seems likely that Saul had taken off some of his outer robes and set one down to do his business, and that's how David was able to cut a piece off. Cuts a piece off the corner of the robe, says, forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. David multiple times talks about Saul as the Lord's anointed. Of course, he was right. He was God's chosen anointed one at a time, but now we know that David is the new Lord's anointed. But David will not lift his hand against Saul. He is waiting. He is patient. David persuaded his men with these words. It's actually a little more forceful. That it almost sounds like he had to hold him back from trying to attack Saul, because they've been running from Saul for years. His men are like, this is our chance to end this thing. Saul leaves. What happens next is interesting. David goes out and called after Saul, my lord the king. And that's a little bit risky, right? Because he's still outnumbered 5-1 if Saul decides to turn and come back and attack. But this is a calculated decision on David's part to do this. And it calls out, to Saul. Saul says, David, why did you listen to the words of the men who say, behold, David seeks to harm you? David is giving Saul the best benefit of the doubt, saying, Saul, if people have told you I'm trying to get you, then it's not true. See, I had an opportunity to kill you, but I spared your life. I said, I will not put up my hand against the Lord's anointed. See, my father, I've cut off the corner of the robes in my hand. For by the fact that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, you may know and see that there is no wrong or treason in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you want my life to take it. May the Lord judge between me and you. May the Lord avenge me against you. But may my hand shall not be against you. And kind of goes on with the rest of his speech there. How does Saul respond? As soon as David had finished speaking the words to Saul, Saul said, is that your voice, my son David? Saul lifted up his voice and wept. It appears that Saul still has just a little bit of heart left. The Holy Spirit is able to work just a little bit, and he realizes how foolish he has been. And for just a little bit of time here, Saul says, you're more righteous than me. You've repaid me good, whereas I repaid you evil. You've dealt good with me, that you did not kill me. If a man finds his enemy, let him go away safe. The Lord reward you. And interestingly, look at what Saul says here in verse 20. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Saul knew the truth. If he was willing to admit it, he knew what was going to happen. But instead of saying, I'm going to stop chasing you, he says, swear to me, therefore, by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and you will not destroy my name out of the father's house. And David swore this to Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. So David is very gracious here. He promises Saul not to destroy his house. So here's the three movements. The first one here is David spares Saul's life in that kind of cave incident. There's that going back and forth with his men. David tries to reason with Saul. And David's promise to Saul. So what kind of themes do we see in here? Well, from David, we see humility, patience. I mean, he knows he's going to be the next king. Everyone knows he's going to be the next king. But he doesn't take matters into his own hand. He waits for God to do it. What else do we see from David in this story? Anything else? Mercy. Yeah. Mercy, wisdom. I mean, yeah, he knew that Saul was still the authority, even though he was a bad and evil authority, and he chooses to keep himself safe, but not to kill Saul, but to wait for God's timing for that. He also, this is really interesting. We could say he seeks to patch things up with Saul. He attempts some form of reconciliation, if it were even possible. And this is, we might say, very Christian of David, that the Christian ethic would seek reconciliation even with an enemy at all cost. Of course, we want to maintain our own safety, but if you have someone who is mad at you, you should seek to make it right. And David seeks to make it right with Saul to the best that he can, and so he does that. So Saul, of course, changes briefly, but we'll see later that he will go back to his old ways. A lot of good applications for us in there with humility, showing mercy, not being quick to take things into our own hand. Man, isn't that tempting? We get impatient. We want things to happen the way we want them to happen, and so we want to take things into our own hand. Patience is difficult, and David is patient. He has to convince his men to be safe and quiet there. And of course, the mercy here points to what? The cross. What did Saul deserve from David? He deserved death, but David shows mercy and doesn't give him what he deserves. A little bit of mercy there points us forward to the cross. And then the last story, chapter 25, is probably not taught on as much, maybe not known as much. It's a little longer narrative, and I wanted to spend some time in it. It's kind of fun, some of the details to get in here. So Saul leaves and goes home. David's out and about, and so Saul kind of leaves the scene for a chapter. He'll come back the next chapter. This chapter begins with a very short note about Samuel's death. And to our ears, we're like, you barely mentioned it and just passed by. But that tells us something. It reminds us that Samuel's not really the main character of the story, even though the book bears his name. This is really about David. So Samuel's death is just mentioned. And then we move into this other story about Nabal. So we'll go through the outline here, and then go back and maybe fill in some details. So we learn about Nabal's foolish behavior. Nabal is a very foolish man and insults David. Then we see David's initial response, and then he meets someone named Abigail, who is Nabal's wife. Abigail intercedes. She tries to mediate. She comes and appeals, another word, to David. And we see something very interesting here. David has a humble response. This contrasts to Saul, that even when people appeal to him, he still doesn't change his response. That the mark of a godly person is, even if you make a mistake, when someone appeals to you, that you would humbly, change. After that, God basically strikes Nabal dead. We see the death of Nabal, and then some verses about David's wives. So let's look at the story. Oops. He went down to the wilderness. There was a man in Moab whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He has all kinds of sheep and goats. He's shearing, so it's harvest time. Man was Nabal. Then his wife was Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. We're not exactly sure what this he was a Calebite means. Obviously, Caleb earlier in the story was a good guy. The name Caleb has connection to the word for dog, and that could be the meaning here. There's a couple places earlier in the narrative where dogs are mentioned as a bad thing. In ancient Israel, dogs were not pets; they were, scavengers. And so to call someone a dog is an insult. So I think that's probably the sense that it talks about. So here we have a real mismatched couple. We have a woman who is beautiful, discerning, wise, and her husband is badly behaved. So David heard that Nabal was shearing sheep, sent 10 of his men over there, says, go there, greet him in my name, and basically say, hey, we've been helping you out. Nothing's gone missing. Ask the young men, they'll show you. Please give us whatever you have on hand to your son David. So they go. This, by the way, was not uncommon, and there was lots of raiders going around. And so David and his men really did provide a service for Nabal and his workers there. This is not like some kind of mob enforcement where, give us, that's kind of what it sounds like to our ears, give us some sheep or we'll let the bad guys come in and get you. That's not the sense here. David had really protected, and we see that David's men attest to that, and Abigail herself knows that later in the story. So David and his men had provided legitimate service. During the time of harvest or shearing, there was an abundance, there was a big feast. That would have been the time to share. But as Nabal in the sharing mood, verse 10, Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is this son of Jesse? There are many servants these days that are breaking away from their masters." Did Nabal really not know who David was? No, everybody in Israel knows who David was. This is just an insult, Just trying to say this is a nobody. He's unimportant. Don't want to give my bread and water to him. So David's young men turn, they come back and tell this to David. So that's the part about Nabal's bad behavior. David's initial reaction is just here in verse 13. What does David do? David said to his men, "Every man strap on his sword." And every man of them strapped on their sword. David also strapped on his sword. About 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. Okay, read between the lines. What's David saying? Let's go get him. Yeah, he went too far. We're going to go, get him and get what we deserve. This story, remember, is sandwiched in between two stories where David mercilessly lets Saul live and spares his life. Here we see David being very quick to anger and being very quick to want to take someone's life. In fact, many suggest that Nabal is the Saul-like character in this story. Nabal is foolish, boorish. He is this Calebite that is badly behaved and does things without thinking and insults people. This reminds us of Saul. This is just what Saul is like. And so we see here that David is not perfect. Even though he was able to be patient with Saul, there's something about what Nabal's behavior that really insults him. And he flies off the handle. He gets all of his men to go, and they go enraged. Okay, so that's how this is the conflict in the story, right? Now we got to see how this conflict is going to be resolved. What's going to happen? One of the young men, one of Nabal's servants, told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "Behold, David sent messengers to greet your master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm. We did not miss anything when we were in the fields, as long as we went out with them." So this confirms that David's men really had been of service to them and deserved some compensation. In fact, they were figuratively a wall to us, both by day and by night, all the while we were keeping the sheep. Now therefore, know this and consider what you should do, for harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him. So that's what the servant says about his master to the master's wife. Now, why doesn't Abigail fly off the handle and say, "I can't believe you called my husband that"? Because it's true. Abigail knows that it's true. And here again, we see all kinds of stories in the Bible where some unnamed character plays a very key role. We don't know anything about this servant besides the fact that he overheard what happened and went and told Abigail and said, "I think you should do something about this because we're in trouble." So he tells this to Abigail. We already know from earlier in the story that Abigail is smart and discerning as well as beautiful. And Abigail made haste. She makes all kinds of food here. Loaves, wine, prepares 5 sheep, grain, raisins, cakes of figs. I mean, this sounds pretty good, right? Put them on donkeys and goes out, says, "We got to hurry up and get out there." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. She didn't want Nabal to stop her from doing this. She rides on the donkey. David and his men are coming towards her. Now just imagine the scene in your mind, right? Abigail with donkeys full of food and probably some servants there with her. And David and 400 men, I mean, they're angry. They're coming ready to fight. And they kind of, you imagine the camels stopping and the dust settling. And here's what happens. David's men came forward, she met them. Now David had said, "Surely in vain I have guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed that belonged to him. He returned to me evil for good." This theme of revenge or vengeance also goes through many of these stories. David taking revenge or seeking revenge or letting God take revenge for him. Of course, God is the one that should do that. God do to the enemies. Oops, went a little too far there. God do to the enemies of David and more also, if by morning I'll leave so much as one male of those who belong to him. So David had this in his mind, not just going and getting some food. He has in his mind going and destroying Nabal completely and his whole house. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from her donkey, fell down before David on his face, bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet, said, "On me alone, my lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal. For as his name is, so he is. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him." That's what Nabal means. Probably not a popular name in Israel. "But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now that my Lord's the Lord lives and your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal." So she comes, she gets off the donkey, bows down, says, "David, please listen to me. When your servants came, I'm really sorry. I wasn't there. I didn't hear what they said. My husband, he's a fool. He's an idiot. We know he's bad. And just, listen to what I'm saying. The Lord has restrained you from blood guilt." And Abigail mentions the Lord many times and uses two different words for Lord. For some reason, this Bible program is not showing, but often in your Bible, some of them you'll see in all caps, L-O-R-D, referring to the divine name Yahweh. And if you see Lord with the other letters O-R-D not capitalized, that's typically Adonai, that can be applied often to just a person in authority, like it is to David. Excuse me, sorry about that. "Now, let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who followed my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant. For the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound. Shall be bound in the bundle of the living, and the care of the Lord your God, and the lives of your enemies shall be sling out from the hollow of the sling." So what's happening here? God graciously sends Abigail. I mean, what would have happened if Abigail didn't come? I think David and his men would have destroyed them all. And it later says, that would have incurred blood guilt on you. But here we see what happens when a true man of God, when he gets angry and fired up and is kind of walking down the wrong path, and someone comes and confronts him, how do they respond? So how does David respond to Abigail? Verse 32. David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you because you have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hands." Wow, isn't this a big theme in 1 Samuel? God is the one that provides salvation. In the story of David and Goliath, David knew that. How is the Lord going to save? It's going to be him. God provides salvation. God provides deliverance. But in this particular story, David had been tempted to take things into his own hands and to try to save himself. Surely as the Lord lives, God has restrained you from hurting me. So think about application here. We often have opportunities out of temptations, right? Where we are getting engaged in something, there's different opportunities where someone might talk to us or our conscience is pricked and we have opportunities to turn and to stop. Interesting, later when we get to 2 Samuel 11 with, the incident with Bathsheba and Uriah, there's a couple people that try to stop David and try to give him hints that you should stop. And later in that story, he doesn't listen. He just plows ahead anyway. But here, he sees the off-ramp from the highway, says, I was going the wrong way. I got to stop, turn around, because I was in the wrong. If you had not come, truly by morning, I would have destroyed everyone. So he does. He grants their petition. There's some interesting narrative that continues here. Basically, Abigail goes back. There's a feast. She doesn't tell Nabal until the next day. She tells him, and this crushes Nabal to find out what had happened. We're not exactly sure what this means, but his heart becomes as stone, and 10 days later, the Lord struck David, and he died. Yeah, would that be consistent with dying 10 days later after that? Okay, there we go. So my audience knows what that is. The point in the narrative is that how did he die? The Lord struck him. David did not have to take things into his own hand. When he was finally patient, God took care of the enemy, and eventually God will take care of Saul, of course. So David hears that Nabal is dead, and he praises the Lord. Blessed be the Lord who has avenged me, received from Nabal, kept back me from wrongdoing. And the story gets, kind of weird. He sent servants to tell Abigail, hey, I want you to be my wife. And so she does. When they came to Abigail, they said to her, David has sent us to take you with him as his wife. So she gets up and goes, takes servants with her. Abigail hurried and rose and mounted the donkey. 5 of her young women attended her. She followed the messenger of David and became his wife. A couple other notes here about David's wives that'll be important later. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was of Galium. So apparently, while David was fleeing from Saul, one of the things that Saul did to try to insult David was to give his wife to somebody else. So here David acquires 2 new wives, one with Abigail that we met, and we don't know anything else about this Ahinoam of Jezreel. Talked about this earlier, I think in the very first session. We see polygamy in many of these stories. That is not to approve it, even for a king, that they should not be in polygamous marriages. But this is how it records it. We could say perhaps that there was some honor in David trying to marry a widow to take care of her. But anyways, Abigail becomes his wife. Not the main way you would seek to find a wife. What are some main themes and applications for us? Are we ever tempted to try to take revenge? Anybody? Yes, myself included. I mean, this is part of the human condition, isn't it? When we've been wronged, we want to take revenge, even for small things. And we may hold these things for a long time. We see David kind of going back and forth here. Another interesting thing we see here is that David is not perfect. The narrator makes sure we know. Why does he try to go to Gath to escape and be safe there? Why does he all of a sudden fly off the handle when he's able to be patient with Saul? We see he is a human. He is not perfect. And so even though David is the anointed king, he is not the ultimate promised Messiah, even though he will do some great things here. Of course, Christ is the one who is perfect. Christ is the one that will get the ultimate vengeance on sin and death. And there will be one day when God will make all things right. Evil tyrants, evil kings exist today. And God sometimes lets them be for seasons, but then he does eventually judge. So before we close, though, I wanted to give a chance to bring up a few questions, if there were some things that were on your mind from any of these, except for geography. I get really confused with the geography of what's going on. Because when we were looking at this, they were like all over the place, back and forth, hiding in caves, in forests, and all over the place. Anything that you noticed in there to either make a comment or ask a question about in these chapters as we looked at this section where David's on the run and Saul is on the pursuit? Give you just a second to think there. This season will last for a while, by the way. It's with 5 chapters, another 5 chapters. It's really 10 chapters in total that David is fleeing for his life and that Saul is pursuing him. God keeps protecting him, though, and eventually God will bring him into the kingdom. So if you do think of questions later, please email them to me, text, call, or whatever, and then we can address them in the next sessions that we're together. Saul will just keep going downhill, as we'll see. He'll make some even worse choices towards the end of his life. But we're thankful for the gospel. We're thankful that it doesn't depend on our actions. And let's close in a word of prayer, shall we? Father, thank you for the ways that you encourage us through your scripture. I pray as we're facing various temptations in our life, perhaps even to revenge or to take things into our own hands, that we will be able to have patience and leave room for you to do your work, both in our hearts and in other people's hearts. We know that you protected David. You also protected Christ while he was here on earth until the time that he would go to the cross to die for our sins. And we know one day you will ultimately make all these wrongs right. Continue to teach us as we study together each week. Bless those that are not feeling well, that are within our church, to bring healing, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, you guys have been a good audience. Thanks those online that are tuning in. Shout out to my family that's watching at home and all the others. Some of you have come up to tell me who you are, so it's been fun. We'll see you next time.